Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thanks so much for joining us for another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're really privileged to be joined by John Hamre, who is the president of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is one of the most important think tanks in the world. And John has an amazing reputation as one of the real statesmen in American political life. So we look forward to our conversation. Let me tell you a little bit about John. He's a native of South Dakota, attended Augustana College in South Dakota. There's one in Illinois, of course. He has an undergraduate degree from there. He went to Yale Divinity School as a Rockefeller Fellow, went to the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, Advanced International Studies for his master's and doctorate work. He then went on to have a really stellar career in government, worked for the Congressional Budget Office, the Senate Armed Services Committee as a professional staff member. He was comptroller of the Department of Defense and then became the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the number two person in the Pentagon. He has been the president of CSIS, as it's known, for 20 some years. He started in 2000 and is just doing some amazing work there. He's also has served as the chairman, president of the Defense Policy Board, which is a really important institution. I want to read, before we go to John, a couple of sentences that were said about him by one of his bosses, Bill Cohen, who was the Secretary of Defense. Bill was talking about John, and he said that he had, quote, the thrift of a banker, the patience of a teacher, the analytical mind of a political scientist, and the divine faith of a minister in the goodness of mankind, which is a remarkable trait to retain after 20 years in Washington. Now, he said that about 25 years ago, so we're very eager to confirm that John continues to have a divine faith in the goodness of man, but we will find that out in the coming minutes. So, John, thank you so much for joining us.
John, you're very kind. You're very kind. Thank you. And I remember our early days when I got here, and you were covering Washington, and it's been too long. So thank you for inviting me. And I also must say, I remember Paul Simon. I mean, when I was a young pup, just starting out up on Capitol Hill and working for a junior member of Congress, Paul Simon was one of those, upper quartile leaders that was shaping the better part of an important discussion in the Congress back when Congress did real work. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen much anymore. So anyway, I'm flattered to be invited. Thank you.
Great. Well, John, you grew up in South Dakota, and I think you were born in Watertown, and then you went to school in Clark. But I was reading a profile of you in the New York Times, which said that you were raised in a community called Willow Lake. And I want to describe what they said about Willow Lake, which they called it a town of 100 people, 40 buildings, and one grain silo, where none of the streets had names and none of the houses had numbers. Now, that strikes me as a reporter who couldn't find what he was looking for and got a little frustrated. Tell us a little bit about Willow Lake.
Well, that was egregiously wrong because we had two grain elevators. It was a tiny little town. I remember when I filled out my first security, the SF-86 to try to get a security clearance, and it asked for where I lived, and I had no idea I didn't know I knew exactly where my home was, but I had no idea what street it was on or whether we never had house numbers. So I called my dad and said, "Hey, Dad, what street did we live on?" He said, "I don't know." It was one of those just little rural, towns. South Dakota is typical, and it was a community. It wasn't a town, and but it was a powerful experience to grow up in a little place where everybody knew you, so you couldn't get in trouble because it would be reported right away to your parents, and but there was a sense that we were all together in a journey, and so I feel very fortunate that I grew up there. It was a rare opportunity.
Well, tell us about your experience at Augustana College. I mean, were you immediately sort of bitten by the political history, international relations bug, and then also to talk about the experience at Harvard Divinity School.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I went to Augustana because my mother had gone there. She was a music student and was a music teacher, and I grew up in a religious family, and so it just was assumed that I would go there. It really was not it was not based on any really, I hate to say it, deeply thought out work on my part. It was just something I did and felt it was, kind of in the trajectory of how my parents thought I should go. But it was a very good thing. And while I was there, I went there thinking I may become a lawyer. And so the best closest you could get to that, and thinking about it, was in the political science department. I fell under the sway of the chairman of the department, is a guy by the name of Alfred Holtz. And Al Holtz had been a research assistant and graduate studies assistant to the great Hans Morgenthau. And he was the one that led me to think about a career in international relations, something I would never have contemplated on my own. I did go to Harvard Divinity School. It was, I hate to say it, a bit of an offering to my mother. She always wanted me to be a minister, and I never really felt a calling to it. But I did go there, and it was a very powerful experience. I went, if I had received a Rockefeller Fellowship, which was a fellowship to let me go to a seminary of my choice, to spend a year contemplating the ordained ministry, and I was not honest with that. I should have gone to a denominational seminary where it would have been a more faithful commitment to the intention of the grant, but I went to Harvard Divinity School because I thought it would not look so strange on my resume if I did not go forward with it. And that, of course, that was cynical and not particularly honest, but it was a remarkably important time in my life, and I rediscovered the foundations of my own ethical framework about how I look at the world. And so I'm very grateful I had the opportunity.
And then at SICE, which is in DC,
Yeah.
I understand your dissertation was pertaining to congressional dissent during the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about your experience at SICE and particularly the dissertation that you wrote.
Well, I think everyone's dissertation starts off in one way and then it ends up in a different way. And I started off the formal dissertation was the origin and significance of the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act was adopted in 1975, and it was after the Vietnam War. And the question I was trying to explore was, why did Congress pass an act at the end of the war after having funded it 113 times during the previous 13 years? What did it mean? And I thought at the time that the War Powers Act was going to be quite impactful. It turned out that was not right. I think my judgment was honest and sincere at the time, but it just was a misreading of the underlying dynamics. And so it ultimately became a study of the way Congress the way the Congress dealt with the Vietnam War. And the culmination of it was the passage of the War Powers Act. So but it was very interesting work, but the conclusions of my dissertation are now irrelevant.
Well, I think a lot of lawmakers too were surprised about how it turned out in the real world. I remember reading quite a bit about it back in the day, and it seemed like how it actually worked in practice was quite
Yeah.
different than how it was conceived. Well, I mean, we could spend the whole time talking about your experience in government,
Let's say, okay,
but
go wherever you want.
no, but I was going to say we could spend it, talking about your time at CBO and Armed Services and the Department of Defense, et cetera. But I do want to spend most of our time talking about CSIS. So I'm just wondering, as you think back on your roughly 20 years working in the government, how that has shaped your views on national security and how it has shaped your roles on how think tanks can help shape national security policy.
Two very different questions. I mean, I was very proud to have worked for the federal government, and I do think it was noble and very important work, and I had enormous opportunities to do that. And I do push all of my young professionals to think about spending time early in their career in public service. Your professional trajectory, even if you're going to end up spending most of it in the private sector, will be dramatically better if you have some knowledge about how the government works. And so I push all of my young professionals here to try to get some opportunity to be in government. It's you have opportunities, responsible opportunities of great significance so much earlier in your career in government than you do in the private sector. You'll work for a corporation for 25 years before you're given something that's anything close to what you'll be given as a responsibility in the fourth or fifth year if you're in government. So I think it's very important for young people that are charting their trajectory, think about public service. It's really important. Now, how has it affected how I do my current job? I've been at CSS now for 24 years, almost as long as all of my government service combined. I was in the government for 25 years, but and I didn't spend any time really thinking about think tanks when I was in government, and so my reflections now look at my experience in government in a very different way, and I still cherish it. But the government has a very hard time understanding what's going on in the world, and it's a product of of the power that the government has. A friend of mine once said, the government has no competitors and it has no customers. The government is its own entity, and people want something. They either want they want the government to help them with a problem, or they want the government to leave them alone with a problem. But they're always coming to the government. And so people in the government have the false impression that they understand what's going on in the world. But the reality is that the government is quite insular. And it's very hard for people in the government to know what's going on in the private sector because there's a regulatory barrier. The private sector doesn't want to approach the government with problems because they don't want the government to overdo it and cause more problems for them. And the private sector or the government people really have, so few of them have any real experience in the private sector. They don't know what it's like. They don't know what's going on. And so over the last 25, 30 years, we've seen a great divide develop between the people that work for the government and people that work in the private sector. They don't understand each other. They don't know how to talk to each other. And we've placed ethical barriers in the way that keep them from interacting in a very fluid way. So the primary role that a think tank plays, my think tank plays, is to provide an honest and safe channel of communication between the private sector and the government. we do. I tell all of my young professionals, I mean, and we're funded by contributions from the private sector, but we do not sit on their side of the table. We sit on the government side of the table. And our role is to try to help the government understand what is the private sector wrestling with? What are they asking for? Where is it in the public interest? Where is it a parochial matter and therefore not in the public interest? And what are the options for proceeding, to find the best solution for the country? And I think any think tank now plays a fairly indispensable role in helping to broker understanding between the private sector and the government, because there's so many changes that are breaking every day. I mean, it's just the world is so dynamic, and it's very hard for the government to understand what it means and how to keep up. I think it's our role to try to be that honest interpreter. It's almost it's almost like an interpreter helping people with two different languages understand each other.
Mhm. Well, John, your mission statement says that your mission is to advance practical ideas to address the world's greatest challenges. It goes on to say CSSI's purpose is to define the future of national security. We are guided by a distinct set of values: nonpartisanship, independent thought, innovative thinking, cross-disciplinary scholarship, integrity and professionalism, and talent development. CSSIS's values work in concert toward the goal of making real-world impact. And
Mm-hmm.
as I read your website and your literature, there is a strong emphasis on real-world impact. So unpack your mission statement to.
Yeah. Well, I'll get to the mission statement in a minute, but let me just take a minute for those who are listening in. The world of think tanks is a lot like the world of uh, commercial construction. Okay, so you have some think tanks that think of themselves as architects. Some think tanks think of themselves as general contractors, and some think of themselves as building material suppliers. And we're a general contractor. We're trying to build something. A lot of think tanks pretend to be architects, but they don't know how to get anything built. They come up with ideas in the abstract, and they don't know how in the world to move anything, and get it constructed. Most of the universities, and forgive me for saying this, John, but most universities are building material suppliers. They are developing new ideas, and that's crucial. You need to have new ideas all the time, but they really don't think about or have an interest in how to get anything implemented into public policy. So we're a general contractor. I mean, our goal is to change public policy. Our goal is to see if there's a void in public policy, how do we fill it constructively? If there's a blockage, how do we remove it? If we have policies that are obsolete, how do they become updated? Uh, Very practical, and we're a project-oriented think tank. I've got about 150 projects underway at any one time. Whenever I meet with scholars, to plan a new project, and we go through tell me what the problem is, tell me what you think the solution is. And then the third question, which is most important, is, and how could we get that implemented? What is the channel of influence that we plan to use to try to change public policy? Again, I'm not interested. I have no interest in having a book published and putting it on a shelf. I have no interest in somebody just writing a monograph and it's it's listed on their resume, but it just sits there. I'm trying to change public policy. The goal is, how do we do that? And so from my standpoint, the most important, engagement with my scholars is, okay, how are you going to get people to implement your ideas? It's fine to have ideas, but how do you get it done? Does this require legislation? If it does, then how do we engage the Congress? Can this be done with executive action only? Okay, well then how do we how do we engage the White House? How do we engage the responsible cabinet secretaries? Is this a project that is of such scale that it has to be done through a large international organization, like say the World Health Organization? How are we going to get to them? How do we do this? And I think the goal that we have at CSIS is to say, it's great to have ideas, but how do we implement things? And so I think foundationally, from our standpoint, the question is always, it's not just to have an idea, it's how do you get an idea implemented? Now, in terms of our mission, I mean, we are we're rigorously nonpartisan. I mean, we work very hard not to have a political bias. And anytime we do, say, a major commission, we'll always have a Republican and a Democrat as co-chairs. We work very hard at not being partisan, and there's a reason for that, because you will never get a durable change in policy on a strictly partisan basis. It becomes the lightning rod for the next campaign. And, look how hard it's been on Obamacare. I mean, that was 10 years of non-ending partisan debate, and it still is a controversial issue. It's settled, I think, now, but it's because it was done on strictly a partisan vote. The Inflation Reduction Act is very controversial still because it was strictly a party line vote. If you're going to get durable public policy change, it has to be on a bipartisan basis. Now that's hard, now in Washington, because our two political parties have become very superficially focused on just how to win the next election. And they don't have, neither party has strategic vision, in my view. And it's all about the tactics of trying to get extra votes in the next election. So it's a challenge for us, but we still think it's the right thing.
Well, John, I mean, you had mentioned the various programs you had. I think you mentioned 150, but I was just looking at your website, and it is breathtaking, the array of issues that you are confronting. I'm going to read just a few of them. Aerospace, Africa, the Americas, power issues in China, the U.S. defense budget, energy security, a futures lab, global food and water, global health, human rights, intelligence, ocean security, transnational threats, et cetera. I mean, just a wide range of issues. And I might just say parenthetically, for people anyone want to go to graduate school, just go on your website, because there is amazing amount of in-depth material. You ought to give a degree, John, because I've spent some time going through your website, and just the substance is just really remarkable. But I guess my big question is, with all of these initiatives, I mean, how do you connect them, or do you try to? I mean, is there a through line that goes through these 150 so projects, apart from the notion of, okay, what is the end result? How do we get a finished product that actually moves public policy?
Yeah, no, that's a very fair question. No, we're a think tank that does not impose a political point of view on our work. Whenever I interview a new possible employee, I always say, we start with a problem, not the answer. Okay, we do not begin any project saying we want to sell this point of view, on the project. And so for me, I let 1,000 flowers bloom. I want we have no editorial control. Well, we do have editorial control in terms of what it looks like, and the coherence of papers and that sort of thing. But there's no intellectual ideological control on our scholars. Every scholar is free to decide what projects he or she thinks is important. I've never once in my professional life here for 24 years told a scholar they had to work on something or they couldn't work on something. So it's up to them. So the goal for us is to say broadly, we're trying to improve the performance of the federal government. And we believe very strongly in fundamental American values, rule of law, accountability of the government to the citizens, transparency in due process, etc. Those values are fundamental, but I don't tell a scholar what I think is an important thing for them to do. I think, I try to create the incentives where they want to pick the most important project because it's in their own professional interest to become a leader in that area, and I'll help them and I'll get out of the way. So no, we don't. The theme that connects all of these things is simply, how do we help the government do a better job of being a government?
Well, John, one initiative that I found really interesting was, I think, a relatively new one. It's called the Congressional Foresight Initiative. And as I read your white paper, my understanding is what you're trying to do is to get lawmakers and their staff, and both are critically important, to start thinking or to think beyond, the short-term
Yeah,
crisis
yeah,
management. Government funding ends on March 1. What do we do? And try
yeah.
to inculcate some long-term planning. And I just came across a quote from Lee Hamilton, who wrote this some years ago, but he said, for members of Congress, he says, we never have time to put our feet up on the desk, look out the window, and think about long-term challenges coming at us down the road. Tell
Mhm.
us how this initiative might be able to help someone like a Lee Hamilton who wants to.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, John. I mean, I remember when I was awaiting confirmation to become the deputy secretary. A friend of mine, he said, I'm going to take you through a mental exercise. You've got three inboxes on your desk. One is urgent and important. One is important but not urgent. And the third one was not urgent, not important. And he said, which of those three inboxes do you go to first when you get into the office every morning? And of course, I said, well, I'd go to the urgent and important, Of course, that's what I should do. And he said, no, wrong answer. He said, you want to always start with the box that has important but not urgent because it gives you time. If you address it that way, it gives you time to find solutions. If you only wait when everything is urgent, you no longer have options to shape the environment for what you're trying to do. So the most important thing, I think, professionally, is to look out into the horizon, over the horizon, and say, "This is a pretty big deal. It's heading our way, and we've got time to try to think it through. Let's focus on that." And I'll give you an example of that. Last year, we decided that um, where the emerging world of artificial intelligence is going to become a real challenge for governments to manage. And so we said, can we come up with a set of guidelines and a framework that would help guide how governments would manage and regulate artificial intelligence? And our strategy was to get this agenda with our framework on the agenda of the meeting of the G7, in Hiroshima. The G7 is the largest, most important, liberal capitalist countries. It's America, Canada, Germany, Italy, Japan,
France, maybe
France, yeah,
UK. Yeah.
UK, and so it's the traditional, I hate to say it, traditional rich white guys, but Japan is in that, and we do also believe, by the way, we have an effort underway now to broaden it to try to bring in Korea and Australia. But it is, how do we get on the agenda of the G7 uh, AI governance and a framework for AI governance, and we were successful. We were very happy with the way that worked out. So what we try to do is to look out into the future and to say we've got time to get the framework right, and so what does it take to do that? Now, now that doesn't keep us from trying to wrestle our way through what do we do about Gaza, what do we do about Ukraine, I mean, so there are things that are burning in the inbox, on the urgent and important inbox every day, and we work on those. But our priority is to try to find what are those things in the important but not urgent category that we can work on as a think tank.
Right. Well, John, I mean, as the wise man of the think tank world in Washington, let's kind of reflect on this almost quarter century that you've been at the helm of CSIS, and how has the think tank world changed in Washington? How has
Hmm.
CSIS changed? Obviously, there's been a revolution in communications that has been profoundly important.
Yeah.
But how has the world changed in the last quarter century?
Well, first of all, I mean, the competitive landscape has gotten dramatically more intense over the last 24 years I've been here. My goodness, we've seen an explosion of think tanks and competition in Washington, and many of them are championing very specific agendas. Um, the climate change agenda has brought a lot of money to Washington in a very set of focused think tanks. For example, the conservative backlash to the progressive agenda of the last 20 years has brought a lot of funding into more traditional conservative think tanks in Washington. So the competition has become much keener. That's one thing. I think the more important factor, John, is that there's no way to say this politely. Um, the quality of government has deteriorated, and it has especially deteriorated in the Congress. Um, when Paul Simon was there, I mean, he was an exemplar of a serious, focused, dedicated public service trying to solve problems. And back then, the Congress was meaningfully an independent branch of government. But over the last 25, 30 years, Congress has diminished itself. And even though our legal structure is that the Congress is an independent branch of government, it now functions overwhelmingly as a de facto Westminster system. So if you wear a blue jersey, you cheer every day for anything that President Biden says. If you wear a red jersey, you boo every day, or vice versa. It's just it's no longer, the Congress is no longer an engine of innovation in its own right. It's no longer the venue of policy innovation in its own right, because it's been rendered so superficial by its own internal dynamics. Now, there have been a couple of important but rare exceptions, I should say, to that. The passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a euphemism, but it was a green energy bill, was a big deal. That got through last year, but it got through only on the narrowest of partisan votes. We saw the CHIPS Act was passed, a major, very important piece of legislation, that was designed to try to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to America. Now, the CHIPS Act was it was about $250 billion, but only 50 billion was funded, and that was just for the semiconductor world. The rest of the innovation agenda was not funded, but at least it was done on a bipartisan basis. But those are pretty rare exceptions to how Washington behaves now. So I think the more serious complication for a think tank is the deterioration of the Congress into more of a pugilistic, combat, ground between the two parties ideologically. We don't play in that. That's not our agenda. And we historically, the way we functioned, 20 years ago was we would get something significant moving in the Congress, and then the administration would say, well, I want to make sure I can shape that. So they'd take it, and then between the competition between the Congress and the presidency, we would get a good outcome. And that's how we got PEPFAR. I mean, we were the think tank that came up with PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Response for AIDS in Africa. And that was a standard process. We can't do that much anymore because the Congress has neutered itself, very unfortunately. And it's been bipartisan. I mean, both sides have neutered their capacity to be independent branches of government and to provide leadership for the country. So the biggest change for me over these 20, 25 years is the diminishment of the Congress and having to work around that problem.
Well, John, I saw an interview which you made some really interesting points about where America is right now. And you, building on the point you just made, you said the two parties are locked in tactical combat,
Yeah.
narrowly divided in terms of numbers. So they're spending all of their energy trying to win the political, game.
Yeah.
You said the think tanks have to become these sort of strategic thinkers of the United States. But you also made the point that you see us as in the kind of the front edge of possibly a 20 or so year period of really deep political instability and uncertainty. Yeah. You drew parallels to 1842 to 60, and then also 1885 to 1915. So build on that notion of think tanks as doing the strategic thinking of the United States while Congress is fighting among itself.
Well, I think John, I think the reference to these two earlier episodes of our national history, these were periods where there were fundamental sign shift inversions of the orientation of political parties. And we are in the middle of that now. The Republican Party, the ideology of the Republican Party now is out of sync with the base of the Republican Party. The base of the Republican Party is much more now a populist party, a blue collar party, a party of workers and farmers. The popular image is the Republican Party as the party of Main Street and Wall Street. That's not the case any longer. The Democratic Party, the popular image of the Democratic Party is the champion of the poor and the dispossessed and the underprivileged. The reality is the Democratic Party today is shaped most primarily by professional elites. The doctors, the lawyers, the architects, the accountants, even senior CEOs. So we have an inversion of the dynamic, the internal dynamic of the party, but it's not been registered in the narrative of the party. And so both parties are wrestling with their own identity at the same time that they are wrestling with, their posture vis-a-vis each other in an annual election cycle. And I don't think either party has articulated a compelling vision about America's future. And I think that's what it will take. It took an Abraham Lincoln to establish the narrative of the future. It took a Teddy Roosevelt to establish a narrative. It took a Franklin Delano Roosevelt leadership to establish a narrative for the future. It's going to take leadership that can define America's situation, but give it a vision about its future. And I don't see either party doing that. Forgive me I'm going to get way out of line here, but the Democratic Party is no longer a party of opportunity. It's a party of justice. It's trying to make right the injustices of the past. The Republican Party is a party of revenge and anger over the directions of a country that they don't like. Neither party has a vision for the future, and I think that's that's what we're going to need here at some point. I think it's going to take many years for us to find that leader, honestly.
John, I read an essay you wrote about a month after January 6th, a few weeks into the Biden presidency. And it was identifying where we are now. And I want you to just reflect on what you said. You're referring, of course, to January 6th, and you said, the United States proved the strength of its democratic institutions, that the politics showed a deeply riven nation. This is a real challenge of the United States remaining a leader of democratic nations. We need now to focus on the profound domestic problems that have generated this political disunion. We can be a strong nation only if we solve these domestic flaws.
Mhm.
3 years later, I mean, do you feel like progress is being made and at least even identifying the problems that are on the agenda? I mean, everyone's talking about income inequality, although solutions are kind of harder to come by. I mean, where are we 3 years after you penned those words?
I think both parties have sharpened their their interpretation of their ideological view of the problem. I don't think either party has found a narrative that has reached across the aisle to find broad-based support. And I think the only issue right now that you could say transcends the divide in the Congress between Republicans and Democrats. The only issue is our fear and anger and hatred of China. And America has never done well when it acted out of fear and anger. I think, and I don't think there's any reason that we should be afraid of China. I look at China and the problems they're wrestling with. My goodness, I mean, it's astounding the structural problems that China has. But we're designing a strategy to attack their strengths, not their weaknesses. I don't think we need to be paranoid about China, but we are. And I think that it's one of those few issues that unites the Republicans and Democrats. But other than that, we've got just a profound divide in this country. And now, having said that, and I'm deeply worried about it. I mean, I do think America's political landscape is the greatest threat that we face as a country. But fortunately, we are a federal system. So much of the strength of this country is at the state and local level. We don't wake up in the morning thinking that we're constrained by what Washington is doing. We've got people all around this country that are inventing new ideas and starting new businesses and creating new programs in universities. I mean, everybody's working because we're a bottom-up society. Our civil culture is a bottom-up culture, not a top-down culture. And any other country that was saddled with our politics, it would be crippling. Here it's bad, but it's not crippling because we're a bottom-up society.
Well, John, you've talked about just the domestic struggles we're going through, and it is occurring at a time that the global landscape is becoming increasingly dangerous. And I'm going to read a couple sentences that you wrote earlier this year. You said the last 2 years have witnessed shocking new developments that have brought geopolitics back to center stage. And then you go on to say what makes this time so unsettling is that it comes when U.S. politics is so profoundly broken. The international consensus that developed in the days after World War II now seems shattered. Congress struggles to find any stable formula for the federal budget. U.S. allies stare in either horror or disbelief. So talk about that and then put it in the context of the landscape now in which we have war raging in Europe, war raging in the Middle East, threats of conflict possibly in Asia, China and Taiwan in
Yeah,
particular. And some analysts have likened this landscape to the 1930s when you had, several different
yeah,
powerful disputes that ultimately morphed
yeah,
into what became World War II. So talk about the global landscape that this broken political system faces.
yeah. Well, yes. I mean, first of all, I think for the Republican Party, what we're seeing is a reemergence of I think the underlying sustaining sentiment of the Republican Party, which is more isolationist. And we had very strong resistance in the 1930s to getting involved in the growing problems with Nazis in Germany, and Robert Taft fought bitterly, against supporting the UK and the lead up. It was Pearl Harbor that changed that. Democrats are really deeply divided. I personally think you would see much more opposition to supporting Ukraine if Joe Biden was not the president. I think Joe Biden being the president, he suppresses the debate inside the Democratic Party. I think there's a very strong progressive impulse in the Democratic Party that does not want to spend money on anything defense, and so both parties, for different reasons, have a very deep ambivalence about America's role in the world going forward. And I think that this troubles me deeply. Now, having said that, I do think that the centroid of American sentiment, if you look at a bell curve, that 67% of people in the middle still believe that it's better for America to be a leader in the world, to shape the world, because it'll be easier for us to manage our own interests and to realize the changes that are in our best interest. It's better for us to be engaged than not engaged. And I think the business world feels that. I think the intellectual leadership of the academic world feels that. The cultural world feels that. So I think Americans intuitively understand that, but it's within the centroid of the American populace. We've got wingnuts on both ends of the spectrum that have such transcending passions that they can't see, in my view, they can't see the reality of the world we're in. But I'm revealing my bias now.
Well, John, in addition to being the CEO and president of CSIS, you also occupy a really important chair at the think tank, the Lang-owned chair of American leadership. Tell us about that chair and how you are trying to use that to shape the debate and influence policy.
I look back over the last. If you look over the last 100 years, this is now about 6 or 7 years ago, we were asked to do a study that looked at the last 100 years, and well, I'll be honest, what it was about. The Japanese government was terrified about the 70th anniversary of World War II. And they said, would you be willing to undertake a kind of a dispassionate review of the last 100 years? And we said yes. Now, and I was deeply involved in it. The 20th century was startling. The first half of the 20th century was dreadful. 2 world wars. Unbelievable destruction in 2 world wars. The second half of the 20th century was an astounding accomplishment of humanity. In 1920, there were about 1 billion people in the world, and 95% of them lived in abject poverty. Today, there are 8 billion people in the world, and only 700 million, it's still a big number, but only 700 million of them live in abject poverty. So we've cut the rate of people living in abject poverty from 95% to less than 10%, as a human community. And we've seen an astounding increase in the quality of life. I tell all of my young kids, I met with them, a bunch of them just last week, and I said, every one of you lives a life far more comfortable than the richest woman of the world, Queen Victoria, 100 years ago, okay? 120 years ago. You live a far better life than she did. You have warmer clothes. You have a richer, better balanced diet. You have instant entertainment. She had to rustle up the money to hire an orchestra to entertain her on a Saturday night. You guys just turn on your iPad or something or other, you've got instant entertainment. Your healthcare is infinitely better than her healthcare was 120 years ago. Each one of you lives such a much better life, every one of you, than the richest woman of the world did 120 years ago. So now, what was the cause for having the first half of the 20th century so dreadful and the second half of the 20th century so glorious? Well, it was the role that America played as a global leader. It shaped an environment that provided security and peace and a channel of prosperity for the vast population of humanity. And this is something we should celebrate. This is an astounding historical accomplishment. We helped create a world that lifted 95% of the population out of abject poverty into comfortable lives and better lives, healthier lives. That's the scale of what's in front of us, okay? And that's what could be lost if we just decide to retreat from playing a larger role. Our lives will be modestly diminished, but the rest of the world is going to be dramatically diminished if we're not going to be a leader. So I think it's extremely important for us to understand we have both an opportunity to improve our own lives, but we have an opportunity to reshape the trajectory of humanity going forward for the better. And we should stop giving lectures about how wonderful we are, but we should start rebuilding what is inspirational in our society. The opportunity that people have to improve their own lives, the role that government plays in making sure it's a level and fair playing field. Those are the things that we did. And I think that's what inspires me to want to still stay in this game. Having been at it for a while, I'm getting old and kind of tired, but I still find the challenge to make an impact it's compelling.
Great. Well, John, I need to ask you how you like to unwind and relax. And I read someplace, actually, a New York Times profile. This was going back some years, but they said that you loved wood carving, maybe going back to your South Dakota roots. In fact, I heard that you did a wonderful model cathedral and a grandfather clock that you gave to a colleague. Is that still one of the ways you can unwind?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, woodworking is a bit of a hobby, and then you may have heard in the background, I've got a clock chiming. It's a grandfather clock I built during COVID. I had to find something to do to keep me, going forward. So I built this and sitting in my little office here, banging away. And just this weekend, I used not all of my tools, but some of my tools to put together a foosball table. So my young professionals, I got to try to find a reason to get them here on Friday afternoons. Okay. They, Fridays we pretty much have everybody back in the office. But Fridays it gets a little thin, and Friday afternoons I could shoot a shotgun down any hall and not hit anybody. So I was assembling this foosball table to try to get people a little foosball, and beer and pizza will help them get them back. No, I still do woodworking. My current project, it's about 85% done, is I've built a replica of the Lincoln Memorial. And there are 54 columns in the Lincoln Memorial, and I was turning all of them on my lathe, and you get through number 10 and you're really kind of bored. You get through number 30 and you're really bored, and then you look and you say, I got another 24 to go. But I did that last year, and I've got it largely finished. I now have to build a stand for it. So, yeah, woodworking is still my is the way I just stop thinking about all the problems in the world, and I'm trying to figure out why I can't cut a straight line on my table saw.
What about reading? I know you probably do so much of it work, but do you are you able to find time to read history, biography, or do you try to kind of lighten it up and murder mysteries or?
No, I tell you, I just I'm currently reading a book. It's called Dark Sun, and it's about developing nuclear weapons and how we use them in World War II to end the war. That's a very interesting book. I also just finished an absolutely splendid book. It was about the intellect and the personality of Abraham Lincoln, uh, beautifully and brilliantly captured by a guy who took a survey of his speeches and traced his intellectual thinking through a series of speeches that he gave, both before he was elected and then through his presidency. Absolutely a stunning work. I'm also, I've got a bunch of books. I'm partway through. I'm always partway through. There's a guy by the name of Walter McDonough who has written two astounding histories of America. One is called, let's see, the second one is called The Throes of Democracy. It was from 1820 until 1880, basically. It takes us through the Civil War and the years after the Civil War. And the first one is something, see, Freedom Just Around the Corner is the name of the first one. And it's from our colonial period up until the War of 1812. And I don't think I ever understood America until I read these two books. They just are. It's an unblinking. He's certainly a deep believer in the unique quality of America's political history and the role that it plays in the world. But it's a very unblinking eye on our history. It's pretty shocking what we were like in the past. And frankly, it's helped me live with some of the worst parts of today. So any one of those, I'd recommend any of your students.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think this McDougall wrote a book on the race for space, the politics of
Oh,
space.
that's interesting.
That is really a very, very interesting read. Just gives you a really intricate backstory on the
Yeah,
politics.
these two books are really phenomenal. I should look at the space one, but these are really absolutely splendid books. They really are. So I recommend them.
Great. Well, John, thank you so much for your time. This has been really a fascinating discussion. And I will say to our listeners, and I'm not saying it just because John is here, but spend some time on CSIS's website, and you will find reports, some wonderfully presented graphics. There's a big graphic display on the international water crisis that is graphically, visually beautiful, but also very nuanced in explaining the genesis of the problem and so forth. So the website really is a national treasure, and spend some time on that. You can really learn a lot.
Well, thank you so much for that, John. It's when I came to CSIS, we had a publications office. We called CSIS Press, and we published a few books every now and then. And no, I don't know. We didn't know what we were doing, and but we all of a sudden found out I was looking. We had a couple 100,000 people coming to our website every day, and we had no idea who they even were. And so we shifted fairly dramatically, and we used to have an editorial department with 5 or 6 editors, now we basically contract that out. But I've got 24 people doing motion graphics, long form video, short form video, podcasts. We have thrown ourselves at the modern digital media because there's so much material facing the world these days. You have to quickly get people a sense of the importance, the significance, and the context of any problem. And we found the best way to do that is through modern digital communication techniques. So tell everybody to look at our stuff. We're delighted to have them there.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much, John. It's been a real
Okay, John. Well, thank you so much for including me. I appreciate being invited. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks all of you for watching this show. We will have it on our video on our website in the coming days. Please send it to family, friends, and help keep the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.